This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a test, and it failed. Two governments told two different stories about one phone call. In international politics, that alone isn't remarkable. Conflicting accounts happen all the time, often quietly, often without consequence. What matters here is what happened next, because power doesn't usually show itself in the initial exchange, but in how each side reacts when the story stops going their way. The real question here is simple, and it's the one most coverage skip past. Who controls the story when pressure fails? That question matters far more than any single interview clip or offhand remark. Control of the narrative is often how leverage is applied before anything more tangible, tariffs, sanctions, or formal retaliation ever enters the conversation. Here's what actually matters. Based on publicly available statements, there was a call between the U.S. President and Canada's Prime Minister. Shortly after that call, a senior U.S. official went on American television and claimed something very specific. Not vague, not implied, specific. That Canada had walked back a major public position. That pressure had been applied. That Ottawa had adjusted its stance. That Canada, in effect, had blinked. That framing was meant to do more than explain a conversation. It was meant to signal that influence still flowed in one direction. It was meant to suggest that the terms of engagement hadn't changed. And it was meant to show that pressure still worked the way it always had. That version of events didn't last. Canada responded publicly, not emotionally, not theatrically, just clearly. The Prime Minister confirmed that the call took place. He confirmed who initiated it. And then he clarified one point that removed all ambiguity. The position Canada had taken earlier still stood. No backtracking, no recalibration, no diplomatic fog, just a correction on the public record. And once that happened, the situation should have been over. In most administrations, that's where the story would end. Conflicting accounts appear. One side clarifies, the other quietly adjusts its messaging, and attention moves on. It's not dramatic, and it's not meant to be. Diplomacy, at its most functional, is about absorbing friction without amplifying it. That didn't happen here. Instead, the same official returned to television and shifted the focus. The explanation gave way to criticism. The substance of the disagreement faded into the background, and attention turned toward the credibility and character of the person who had delivered the correction. That sequence matters. So let's slow this down and look at it cleanly, without the noise, without the commentary layers, and without assuming motives we can't verify. First, there was an attempt to frame the call as a moment of submission. It was an effort to establish that pressure had worked, and that Canada had adjusted its behavior accordingly. Second, that framing was publicly corrected. It was corrected in a way that left little room for reinterpretation, and it left no room for a quiet walkback. Third, the response was not a factual rebuttal. It wasn't new information, and it wasn't an alternative account supported by evidence. It was personal. That tells us something important, not about personalities, but about leverage. Quick context. In Ottawa terms, none of this was dramatic. It was procedural. When two governments offer conflicting accounts of the same interaction, the standard move is to clarify your own position on the public record. That's not escalation. That's housekeeping. And housekeeping can be powerful, because in geopolitics, narrative isn't just messaging. It's leverage. Pressure tactics rely on ambiguity. They rely on the idea that the stronger party can define reality, or at least shape the perception of it, while the other side quietly absorbs the cost. As long as the record stays fuzzy, pressure can be applied without being openly contested. The moment that ambiguity disappears, the effectiveness of pressure changes. When the record is clarified publicly, the cost of pressure goes up. Often that's enough to alter behavior without raising the temperature at all. Not because the weaker party suddenly gains dominance, but because the terms of engagement become visible to others who are watching. This is why clarification matters more than it appears at first glance. Clarification doesn't insult. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't escalate. It narrows the room to maneuver. Once something is said clearly and publicly, everyone else can see it. Allies, markets, other governments, policy analysts. The option to quietly reinterpret events or retroactively redefine what really happened disappears. That's not symbolic. That's practical. And that's the difference between noise and leverage. What stands out here isn't the disagreement itself. Countries disagree constantly, sometimes sharply, sometimes quietly. What stands out is how quickly the dynamics shifted once the narrative could no longer be controlled by one side alone. Not because of the call itself, but because of what happened after the call. When the clarification landed, the original claim couldn't be sustained without contradiction. And at that point, the available options narrowed quickly. Adjust the story, disengage from the issue, or redirect attention. The choice was redirection, away from the facts and toward the person delivering them. Now, this is where it's important to be precise. A personal attack does not prove panic. It does not prove desperation, and it does not prove intent. We do not have access to private deliberations. We do not see internal strategy discussions, and we cannot know emotional states. So we shouldn't pretend that we do. What a personal attack can indicate in some cases is a loss of narrative control. In political communication, when the facts on the table stop working, attention often shifts to the messenger, not necessarily to win the argument outright, but to change the frame, to make the disagreement about credibility instead of content. That pattern shows up across countries, across systems, and across political cultures. It isn't unique, and it doesn't require speculation to observe. What matters here is the effect. The effect is contrast. On one side, you had a short clarification. It was delivered without insult, and it was followed by silence. On the other side, there were repeated media appearances, sharper language, and a growing focus on personal credibility. That contrast is visible to everyone watching, and visibility matters in power politics. This shouldn't make people panic. It should make them pay attention, because this wasn't really about a speech, and it wasn't really about a phone call in isolation. It was about whether clarification would be treated as defiance, and whether defiance would carry a cost. In this case, clarification didn't trigger escalation. It triggered exposure. That's the shift. And it's worth sitting with that, because exposure is often more destabilizing than confrontation. Confrontation invites symmetry. Exposure invites scrutiny. When scrutiny replaces ambiguity, leverage becomes harder to apply quietly. Pressure doesn't disappear, but it becomes more expensive, more visible, and harder to deny. Now, it's important to say what this is not. This is not proof of long-term weakness. This is not a decisive turning point. And this is not a guarantee of future outcomes. It is one data point, but it's a meaningful one, because it shows that intimidation does not automatically produce compliance. And when that lesson becomes visible, even briefly, it affects how future pressure is applied, not just toward Canada, but toward others watching the exchange and quietly taking notes. Canada didn't escalate here. Canada clarified. And clarification raised the cost of coercion without raising the temperature. That matters for a country that operates best when disputes stay procedural rather than theatrical. It matters for a government that prefers predictability over spectacle. And it matters in a moment when many countries are reassessing how much room they have to push back without triggering retaliation. From here, the cost of forcing the issue goes up. The conditions are set, and the position is now clear. What happens next will depend on whether that clarity holds, whether future interactions reinforce it, or whether they attempt to blur it again. That doesn't end the story, but it does reshape the playing field. And in power politics, reshaping the playing field often matters more than winning any single exchange. That changes the math.